Welcome to Law and Justice. I'm Jane Mulcahy. This is a special series on the topic of how to talk policy and influence people. And today I'm very excited to be joined by Dr. Pat Bracken, who is a psychiatrist and also very interested in philosophy. Hi, Pat. Thanks for joining me.
Hi, Jane. Hi.
It's very good of you to take the time. Pat, I suppose if we start maybe by you telling me a bit about yourself and your background and how you developed your interest in psychiatry and philosophy.
Okay. Well, I'm from Cork. I grew up in Cork City and went to school there. I went to UCC, did my primary medical degree in UCC. I graduated in '82 and I went to medical school because I wanted to do psychiatry. And I think I was somewhat unusual in that, particularly at that time. There weren't a lot of medical students, if you like, who saw themselves kind of working in the mental health field. I mean, a lot of people kind of did end up in that afterwards, but I think the idea of being a doctor and doing surgery or general practice or whatever it was more attractive to people at that time. Working in mental health wasn't the kind of goal for a lot of my student colleagues at the time, but that's the only reason I did medicine. I was always interested in madness and diverse states of mind and the relationship with human creativity. So I, from an early age, that's kind of what I wanted to do. So I went through medical school and went straight into training in psychiatry then in Cork in the 1980s. At the same time, I think I was pretty much aware, even from my early studies in psychiatry, that the discipline was making a huge number of assumptions that, you know, by dealing with problems of the mind, mental problems, in the same logic and the same way that it dealt with problems with the body, with our lungs, our livers, just using that same way of thinking to apply that to mental health problems, I started to feel early on was problematic. So I went a different route alongside, a parallel route, if you like, to studying medicine and medical psychiatry. I started to study philosophy, and I also did that at UCC. Way back in the 1980s, and it was a diverse department of philosophy at that time, and it was great. I really appreciated the people who were there at the time. I got a lot from them, and I pursued a BA and an MA and then later went on to do a PhD in the University of Warwick. This was a good deal later. Warwick had set up a particular department that was interested in philosophy of mental health. Wow. Professor there was Professor Bill Fulford, and I did my PhD with Bill back in the 90s, I think that was. So yeah, I had this kind of dual kind of approach. And I think what I got from philosophy is a questioning approach. Philosophy is just about questions. It was, you know, it's about asking questions and never stopping. So you never come up with the right philosophy. There isn't such a thing. Philosophers will, you know, just keep picking things apart. And I think I got, from studying philosophy and studying psychiatry at the same time, I got that kind of questioning approach to psychiatry very deep inside me. So everything psychiatry would kind of take for granted or assume, I would be questioning that and saying, well, where did that idea come from? And trace it back to its origins and tease it out. And you find in the end that a lot of the assumptions are kind of not very, very robust, you know, and they start to fall apart. So you start to see, in fact, where a lot of the problems come up for psychiatry, and particularly in relation to the concept of mind. You know, what is mind? How do we think about mind? What is it, you know? And can you think about the mind and its problems in the same way that you would think about an organ of the body? Can you study it in the same way? Can you come up with treatments that you apply to it in the same way? And I think you can't, basically. I think the mind, whatever it is, and I'm not going to give you a definition for that, you know, but whatever the mind is, it's not just a thing in the world, the same as my telephone is there on the table, or my liver is tucked under my ribs. The mind isn't that kind of a thing. And so I think we need to be a lot more sophisticated in how we grapple with the issues. Anyway, that's a divergence from my own history, but it gives you some flavor of where I come from, and that kind of what led me to become what I would call a critical psychiatrist, and being part of what we now would call the critical psychiatry movement. When I worked in Bradford in the UK back in the late 1990s, we set up a critical psychiatry network back around 1998, there was 6 of us at the time, kind of from around the UK. We were particularly concerned at that time about the role of the pharmaceutical industry in terms of shaping psychiatric research and dominating the way psychiatry was doing research. But so a number of us got together and we started a group in Bradford, and that subsequently became the Critical Psychiatry Network. That's now, there's over 200 psychiatrists from around the world actively involved in discussions and networking. We have a conference every year. People publish together. It's a forum for sharing ideas. Not everybody agrees with everybody else. There's a lot of divergence between people, but it's an active network of critical thinkers within psychiatry. So that's a kind of route I went in terms of the philosophy and that. What I also kind of, I think, did that was significant in my own career was after training in Cork, I did my early training in the hospitals around Cork at the time. And I think I became quite disillusioned after about 4 years. I did my early exams and I just said, I'm not sure I can continue to work in this system the way it is, you know. So I left in 1987 and I decided that I basically couldn't go on working in that system, and I was going to pursue a career just in philosophy at that time. But I saw a job advertised, a little job advertised in the back pages of the British Medical Journal. That's where doctors look for jobs, you know. Sure, there's the same thing in law, but the jobs pages of the BMJ was where we certainly looked at that time for jobs. And there was just a job looking for an advertisement looking for a psychiatrist to work with victims of torture in Uganda. Wow. This was in 1987. And it caught my imagination and I applied, and it was with an organization in London called the Medical Foundation for Care of Victims of Torture. They were a new organization at the time. They'd grown out of the British kind of Amnesty International, medical side of Amnesty International in London. And they just got together and they just got some money from Amnesty International and the UN to set up a project for victims of torture in Uganda. The regime in Uganda had changed the previous year in 1987. The current president, Yoweri Museveni, came to power, and he was promising, after decades of Idi Amin and Milton Obote and Uganda being synonymous with human rights abuses, Museveni at that time was a young revolutionary leader who was promising that the regime would be more respectful for human rights. And so negotiations took place, and the Medical Foundation were setting up a project there. So they recruited me and another doctor from UK, Joan Giller. We were subsequently married and spent our lives together. Yeah. But so it's Love in the Tropics. That's where we met, and it was probably one of the most ill thought out projects in human history, sending 2 young white doctors into the middle of Africa. But Joan and myself decided pretty early on that, look, even if we can't do anything to help people here, let's not harm people, you know. So we went about our work very carefully and very cautiously in terms of introducing practices and concepts and assumptions and priorities that maybe weren't going to ultimately be helpful to people on the ground in Uganda. And so I became very deeply interested in anthropology.
Okay.
The cross-cultural study of mental health and mental health problems from a cross-cultural point of view, and the limitations of Western concepts in that particular context. And at that time, this is the late 1980s, the concept of post-traumatic stress disorder had just been kind of launched, really. That grew out of American involvement in the war in Vietnam and a particular concern for young veterans coming back from Vietnam. There wasn't a diagnosis that psychiatry and psychology had to use for them. So they kind of cobbled together this idea of post-traumatic stress disorder. It was launched in 1980 in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM of the American Psychiatric Association, and it took the world by storm. It's kind of one of the most commonly used pieces of psychiatry now in many domains, including your own in law. And it's become a hugely important, diagnostic category. We became very suspicious of it early on and very critical of it, and started to write about that. Given our experiences in Uganda, we started to really critique it from a cultural point of view. And I guess that's one of the things I would be known for, and Joan would be known for, was raising questions about that export of Western psychology and Western psychological assumptions in a cross-cultural context.
If I may just come in there, I read a piece in Mad in America before by a Maori doctor, a Maori psychiatrist, and there are not that many of them, I believe, in New Zealand, tiny number. But like that now, she was saying that we've imported the Western diagnostic system into other cultures, and it's a very uncomfortable fit, and also denies really the consequences of cultural trauma and having lands divested from people, the kind of cultural genocide often that was perpetrated by imperialist powers trying to just decimate ways of living and customs and practices. Did you find that type of thing as well when you were in Uganda? Because obviously I presume people who were coming out of that torturous regime might have displayed some of those classic PTSD symptoms, nightmares and flashbacks or things like that, having endured unspeakable physical torments.
I mean, what we found was that people had gone through incredible traumas, incredible suffering, from torture to rape to disfigurement to bereavement. The most horrendous things, but what struck us, I think, most of all, was that when we were there as a medical psychology, if you like, offering that kind of inputs, that's not actually what people wanted. Very few people actually came and said, I want therapy or I want counseling. What the priorities for people were about getting a way of life back working again. And we worked with a particular village. We used to spend a lot of time there outside of Kampala in a place that was known as the Luwero Triangle. It was a region of Uganda to the northwest of the capital, Kampala, that was particularly devastated in the early 1980s. Basically, there was a guerrilla army. Museveni's army was organizing in that part of Uganda, and the government forces under Milton Obote just adopted a kind of scorched earth policy and basically tried to make sure that nobody stayed there. So their soldiers went in, killed people, tortured people, mutilated people, and people fled from the whole area. It's estimated, there are different estimates, and it's hard to know exactly, but I mean, there's no doubt about it that hundreds of thousands of people lost their lives in those years. When we went there in 1987, people were just starting to come back. And it was a little bit like, it was known as the killing fields of Uganda, because just as in Cambodia under Pol Pot, there were so many people killed in rural areas that there wasn't time to bury people. So when people came back into their fields and gardens, they found skulls and bones, literally, of hundreds of people. So they started to gather them, put them on little trestle tables. So you'd be driving along in Luero, and you turn around a corner, and you suddenly be confronted by this table with maybe about 50 to 100 skulls on it. So it was that kind of a place. It was that kind of a genocidal kind of brutal campaign. And what struck us was that what people were wanting was to rebuild their villages. That was the priority to them, to rebuild a way of life, an economy, get their schools going, get their trading centers going again, get their fields dug so they could plant. And when you think about it, what that's all about, it's all about having a future.
Yes.
Not just individually, but having your family have a future, your children, you know, that you can eat, that you can look forward to something. You know, so those are the priorities for people. And what I really learned from that was that you can't think about trauma or suffering on an individual basis as something that just happens inside someone's little compartment in their mind, because what people are doing is trying to make meaning out of suffering. Meaning is what human beings sustain. It's what sustains us more than anything else. You know, it's the one thing we can't live without. You know, we can't live without meaning and connection with other people. And so people were wanting to create that. And if you just dealt with people individually, you run the risk of cutting them off and getting them to focus on their own individual narratives rather than communally building something together about the future. I was struck particularly by, we worked with the Ugandan government at that time, had set up a commission to inquire into past human rights abuses. And that had completed, or was completing by the time we were there in 1987, 1988. But we went and we met with the woman who was in charge of doing that, a policewoman who had gone around and found people who would testify. And so she gave us a list of some of the people who had been terribly tortured, you know, because we were there under the auspices of this organization that was dealing with victims of torture. So we took it on ourselves to go and find those people. They were in villages. You couldn't just send them a letter and say, come and meet me in my office. And, you know, it didn't work like that. Telephones weren't working. So you literally had to get the person's village, drive out there, ask questions as to where they were and find them, you know, and we did. We found all of those people on the list she gave us. And none of them were asking for psychotherapy or whatever. All of them were kind of more or less getting on with their lives. Right. I remember I've been particularly struck by one man who had his hands chopped off, literally chopped off by the soldiers and left to die. And this is something you hear about in different conflicts. Remarkably, he was taken by people to a hospital, and there was a doctor there, a surgeon, who did a remarkable operation on both sides. So he separated the bones in his forearm and gave him kind of claw-like kind of mechanism. It was very kind of primitive, but he could have basic things. But he was completely dependent on other people, literally to feed him. He couldn't do that himself, and they did. And his villagers around him fed him. And when we went to see him, he was in good spirits. He had started by his own ingenuity and getting a couple of people to work with him, a brewing business. And he was organizing, he was the brains behind it. And he had a brewing business going. And his big problem was transporting the banana beer that he was making, basically, as markets were opening up for him. And what he wanted from us, we explained we were there, we come to see him and all the rest of it. And he said, that's fine, all the rest of it. Can you buy me a bike? Okay. That's what he wanted us to buy him. You know, or give him. It was a practical thing to allow him to get it. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to say people weren't deeply suffering. People lost relatives, went through awful times. They did. But the focus on just a few symptoms of intrusive and avoidance symptoms or whatever. Yes, people had all of those things when you asked. And I did a survey of the whole village. We asked everybody. We developed our own questionnaire. We went through the whole village and yes, people had all of those things. But those weren't the kind of things that people were preoccupied with. Those weren't the kind of things that they were particularly concerned about. And the things that they were concerned about were often quite practical things. And
it's very interesting, the kind of idea though of coping as well, and focusing on, as you say, building a future, a communal future, not just an individual one, because we're a group species. We survive best with one another and have to cooperate and all of that. But I'm just wondering, in terms of intergenerational trauma and the transmission of pain and suffering, particularly if you don't work through things, you know, or even give yourself the time and space to make meaning of what has happened, can that have repercussions for say, if the grandchildren of some of those people, perhaps, if there was a
I honestly don't know. I honestly don't know. And I keep a very questioning mind in relation to all of that discourse. I have no doubt that that we all carry down stuff in our lives that come from our parents, that come from their parents. But very often, the context of our lives are very different to theirs, and we make sense out of things in terms of what's going on right now. I'm always a bit skeptical with the idea that we can put any singular model onto human beings and try and say that this will explain what's happening with a particular problem, with a particular person at a particular time. Human beings are massively diverse, and we are, as I say, meaning is the thing that we live in, and we live by, and we find. And meaning comes into our lives through language, through symbol, through culture, and all of those things are shaped by history and go back in such a way that it's massively, massively complex and diverse. And there's no model is going to simplify all of that massive complexity of the symbolic, meaningful world in which we live. All we can do is learn to swim in it, you know, and do the best we can to swim in it and find connections with other people in that process. That's about the best we can hope for, I think. And I'm always a bit wary and skeptical when someone comes along and says, I've got a model that will actually explain human suffering and why people do the things they do. The reasons people do things they do are massively complex, you know. And as I say, that's not to say that you can't explore, you can't research, you can't make connections, you can't tease out things that are complex, but you always have to be doubtful of what I would call grand narratives. I come from a tradition in philosophy that would question the idea that we will ever come up with grand stories that fit all the pieces of human reality together, like Marxists did, or psychoanalysis would try to do, or liberalism would try to do. There are holes in all the discourses we produce to explain ourselves and our realities, and we just have to live with that. We have to learn how to live with complexity, diversity, and uncertainty. And that's hard. Because, you know, we like certainty and we want it. And
and when people are feeling very distressed, or, you know, for some people quite out of control, and they frighten themselves maybe, or they frighten their loved ones, you can see why a quick solution, whether it's in the form of medications or a diagnosis, you know, affords them at least some sort of security or an explanation. Just in terms of mainstream psychiatry, though, do we explore people's context and their own meaning making enough. For example, I've read some pieces, say by John Reed and others going back a while, or Sandy Bloom, about how it all of a sudden it dawned on her when she heard one person's story dawns about incest that came out way later, that actually people had been giving them little signs and symbols all along of child abuse or neglect, or various stories in their past, but they hadn't tuned into them, and that psychiatrists weren't asking about them. Do psychiatrists do that more now? Try and get as full a story from the person as possible about?
I think it's like I can't speak, for all of psychiatry, and psychiatrists vary greatly in their practice, but I am concerned that the direction psychiatry has gone in since the 1980s, 90s, in becoming very involved with pharma and biological explanations, and seeking a biological explanation for all the sort of difficulties that we have. It's not just me saying that, that it's Stephen Schafferstein, who was president of the American Psychiatric Association, famously said that psychiatry is in danger of not using the biopsychosocial model, but just using the bio model. And I think he put his finger on something very important there, that there is a tendency, I think, particularly within American psychiatry. I mean, American psychiatrists have said I'm unfair to them, but I do think that it's more there than perhaps anywhere else, of this notion that everything to do with the mind can be explained by the brain. And our job is just to do more and more, either genetic research or biological research. And through that, we'll come up with explanations for all of the things that afflict us as human beings. And I think that's that approach. Don't get me wrong, I'm a doctor, I'm interested in biology, I use medication, but I think just that very, or an overemphasis on biology. I think it is a fair critique of psychiatry to say that it has been in the embrace of that way of looking at things for the last 20, 30 years. Whether it's coming out of it, I don't know. But there are signs, like I say, our own movement is one small bit of a sign that a lot of psychiatrists are questioning it, certainly, questioning that kind of biomedical approach, wanting to open up different discourses. But we can't just fall back into another model coming along and saying, because prior to that, psychoanalysis dominated American psychiatry, and I don't think that was healthy either. So I don't think it's either you have all some psychological theory or a biological theory. What I think we all the theories neglect is the contextual. And I think what I've learned over my career, for what it's worth, is just the importance, as I said before, of meaning making to us, and how we understand suffering, where suffering comes from in our lives, and how we overcome that. And I think we are remarkably resilient. I've worked with people in many different contexts, and seen people get better and stop being stuck and move on. Sometimes I think we've helped from psychiatry. Other things, I think we've gotten in the way of someone helping themselves. But I think it's just a lot more, the territory of mental health, and if you want to use the term mental illness, is just a lot more complex than sometimes some of the simplistic models that are present in psychiatry and sometimes in psychology as well would allow us to think,
I just read a piece this afternoon via Twitter by Joanna Moncrief, who I think is involved with the Critical Psychiatrist Network. And she concluded by saying that psychiatry is essentially a political activity, in which, it's one of our ways of controlling awkward or difficult social behavior. And obviously a lot of the discourse there was around big pharma and that dominant approach. Bessel van der Kolk as well has said, you know, that medications can be very helpful for bringing someone who's way out there, extremely distressed and not able to function, back into the here and now, which strikes me as kind of a small bit similar to what you were saying about the Uganda torture survivors, that they wanted to just focus, really. They wanted to be able to function in the here and now and have a life in the here and now. Another thing that comes up a lot is that actually it's not so much the intervention itself as how it's delivered. So the relationship between the practitioner and the person with the distress. Would you have any thoughts on that issue, the importance of relationship?
Absolutely. I think that's the key to good mental health work, you know, and I've worked in many different settings. You mentioned the psychiatrist on Mad in America.
Yeah.
I think you're talking about Diana Kapua.
Yes, I didn't know how to say her name there.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Diana.
Amazing.
The paper that she was talking about is a paper that we wrote together.
Oh, right, nice.
Yeah, because I had a wonderful opportunity. I retired from my post in West Cork. I was clinical director in West Cork. And I retired early in 2016. I wanted to have a bit of space in my life before I stopped working to do a few different things. And one of the things I always wanted to do was to work with Maori people in New Zealand. And I connected with Diana and went over there for about 4 months in 2017. And I had a great time. It's a really fascinating country. And dealing with the post-colonial legacy is like everyday stuff across the board in New Zealand. 15% of the population are Maori, but the majority of female prisoners, more than 50% of the prisoners in jail in New Zealand are Maori. Okay. They're completely disadvantaged across all of the indices, and in mental health as well. They get the very kind of coercive side of mental health intervention. So they're overrepresented in all of the things you don't want them to be overrepresented in. Hospital admissions, coercive admissions, you know, ECT without consent, all of those kind of things. And Diana is on a mission to try and change things radically by moving away from using Western psychiatric discourse to using a form of practice based on Maori psychology. And they have a very deep legacy of creation stories, which informs a whole way of thinking about the nature of human beings, the nature of families, the connection between human beings and the natural world, and the spiritual world, and the historical world of kin. It's a fascinating way of being in the world, the Maori Polynesian kind of way of being. And she is trying to use that psychology to frame an approach to people in difficulty, children and adults and that. And I connected with her because the critical psychiatry stuff was I think, helpful in the sense that it was kind of like turning down the loud noise of Western psychiatry and allowing a space for an indigenous psychology to actually work. So myself and Diana got on very well. Unfortunately, I only had a few months out there, but I learned a great deal and got a great deal from that. I can't remember where the question.
We're talking about relationship, but while you pause there, my own interest in prisons certainly has brought me into looking at prison systems elsewhere, from the New Zealand one to Canada, where again Indigenous people are grossly overrepresented. They're way more often placed in seclusion or solitary confinement, much higher rates of mental illness. But of course there are huge parallels there with the taking of children into care, taking them from their families, you know, being raped in institutions. And it's kind of, you know, we have our own issues with travelers here where we've displaced them. We've tried to annihilate a way of life. And some of the health and mental health impacts are similar, and suicide rates are similar. But funnily enough then, I think, or not funnily enough, but a lot of the practices, the group practices around drumming and dance and communal singing are apparently very naturally healing practices. That some of the psychiatrists and neuroscientists say regulate the nervous system and stuff like that. But is there something that we can learn from other cultures in terms of the prioritizing of healing relationships, do you think?
Well, I think in general we can learn it from indigenous communities and cultures that would put a priority upon relationships, and but I think we can also learn it from our own science, because the science of psychology, of treatments, of psychiatric treatments, the actual empirical data around what works points us, for example, like psychiatric treatments work, I mean, people get better, like you take something as common as depression, wherever that is, but, lots of people get very depressed and they go to doctors, GPs or psychiatrists. Very often now, the commonest kind of thing is that they're prescribed antidepressants. In studies of antidepressants, maybe about 60%, 65% of people get better, or they report some improvement after a while. But in those studies, in the well-controlled studies where there's a placebo arm to the study, so people don't know whether they're getting the placebo or the active drug, lo and behold, practically as many people who are taking the placebo in those studies get better as well. So it's not to say that taking the medication isn't helpful, but it's why is it helpful is the big question. And I think that the thing that we massively think about in medicine is the role of what we call the placebo effect. And we tend to be dismissive about it, but actually in psychiatry, it's probably the biggest element of what we do. And what's the placebo effect? It's about creating a context where someone, as we've already discussed, has a name for something, an explanation, a context with a helper who's going to help them explore that. They've something to do. There are rituals around it. And crucially, if the relationship is a trusting one with that helper, with the practitioner, they develop hope. There's a sense in which this person, working with them, I'm going to get better. I'm going to have a future. I'm going to move on from being stuck where I am right now. And those ingredients, those things about trusting relationships, the generation of hope, the finding of meaning, a space to explore safely, those are actually the key ingredients to successful medical treatment with drugs in psychiatry. And if you look at the world of psychotherapy, again, you look at psychotherapies for conditions like depression or anxiety, whatever. Lo and behold, again, there's 65, 70% of people who go for psychotherapy say, yeah, I got something from that. I feel better after going from it. But after about 40, 50 years research on psychotherapy, because there's many, many different forms of psychotherapy, from Freudian psychoanalysis to CBT to dialectical. There's all sorts of therapies. There's hundreds of them, and all of the research, again, and this isn't just me saying this. This is this very standard empirical science in psychology. It actually doesn't matter a whole lot what form the psychotherapy takes. Whether it's CBT or anything else. What actually matters in psychotherapy is whether it's about the relationship between the person coming and we call it the Therapeutic Alliance. That actually accounts for much more of whether the therapy is going to be successful than anything else, really. And whether when you go for therapy, if you feel I can relax with this person, I can talk to them, they understand what's going on for me, I come away from the sessions with this person feeling more hopeful. So it gives me the motivation to go and make changes in my life, which then give me a sense of being a little bit more in control, and I move on. They're the key ingredients of psychotherapy. It's not anything that Aaron Beck thought up in terms of not to dismiss those things, that they're not unimportant, but they're not the most important things that are going on in psychotherapy. So when you look at the results of psychopharmacological studies and psychotherapeutic studies, actually, our treatments are helpful. Mm-hmm. The way we work with people are very often helpful, but they're helpful to the extent that we're doing good relationship work with people. We're doing good meaning-making work with people. We're doing good work that gives people a sense of being heard and respected. I talk about it as being the non-technological aspects of our work. Yeah. So they're about values, meanings, and relationships. And traditionally, psychiatry would regard them, it wouldn't be dismissive of those aspects, but it would see them as kind of secondary factors to the really important stuff, which is about diagnosis and treatments and interventions, and all of that kind of research would be on biology and genetics and brain scans. And yes, okay, relationships are important, but they're not the real meat of psychiatry. What I believe is that we have to reverse that relationship of priorities and actually start to see those non-technological issues being, that's the really important stuff when it comes to mental health. Mm-hmm. And it's not to dismiss the other things. Yes, we need to be careful we're not missing medical conditions that can present, so diagnosis is important. All of those things are important, but they're not the really central things that drive progress in therapy in mental health work.
I'm conscious now I've held you for a very long time. Are you doing okay?
I'm doing okay. I'm still here with you.
Okay, yeah, you haven't toppled. There's a guy called Dan Siegel who I've read a bit by, who does work on interpersonal neurobiology, where he tries to bring various sciences together, including attachment, and kind of saying that we exist in the world and we're a product of our experiences and our relationships, and that, again, going back to the relationship, that healing or managing one's distress or feeling safer in the world is contingent on our relationships, which I think is pretty interesting. And I heard a guy called Dr. Tony Humphreys at the Critical Voices Network conference just last year. He's a psychologist and was saying, in ways you have to wonder at the ingenious ways that some people have of coping, with very, very difficult life circumstances. So again, the creativity of finding this way to survive in the world. And it's about being curious, really. And he mentioned a man who went around saying that he was Jesus, and he'd be brought into the institution every few months after getting out. And eventually he just asked him, well, what do you get from this? What does being Jesus bring you? It's just that curiosity. Is curiosity an important quality in a psychiatry?
Absolutely. And just to connect with what you're saying, I mean, one of the really interesting, for me, one of the really exciting things that has happened in the field of mental health since I started training in 1983, back in the 1980s, is the rise of what we call the service user movement, particularly in Western countries, but it's now, there's an African organization of users and survivors of psychiatry. There's a worldwide network of people, in different countries who have used mental health services, who've started to become organized and articulate and write and have conferences, and are coming at the whole issue of mental health from a very, very different angle than we've traditionally come at from those of us who are professionals and academics and writers and that. And so they're telling us very, very important things about what helps, what doesn't help. And one of the things that has emerged, I don't know if you were familiar with the Hearing Voices Network.
Yes, yeah.
It has emerged in the last 30 years. And that is about people who hear voices starting to say, actually, psychiatry has regarded our experiences as pathological, as something that's a kind of misfiring of the brain. And the only thing that you've given us are drugs to suppress that. Nasty drugs to suppress that have a lot of side effects. One, a lot of those drugs don't work for us. And two, the side effects are terrible. And three, actually voices are something that are meaningful to us, and we want to explore them. And so a whole network of hearing voices groups, which are very often set up by people who hear voices themselves, or by an interested professional like a psychologist or occupational therapist or a nurse, all around the world now, particularly in Europe, North America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, but also in Japan. There's a couple in Africa, where people come together to explore their voices and look at different explanations for them. And that is exactly one of the things they will do in hearing voices groups, is to really tease out the nature, they will be curious about where the voices come from, what they mean in that person's life, how the person copes with them. And in that context of peer support and solidarity and curiosity, often people start to reshape their relationship with their voice. So they're not just a victim of a domineering voice, but they can actually get to a point, not where the voice goes away necessarily, but where they feel empowered to deal with it better and to actually control it in a way that they couldn't do before they went through that process. They felt controlled by their voices. Now they've moved to a situation where they feel that bit more in control. So that's an example where I think curiosity and openness, and an openness to diverse explanations and understandings, is very, very important, and is now an important kind of, not a treatment, but a way of a pathway for people to move on from being stuck.
And in West Cork there's a practice called open dialogue, I believe, which again is a particular way of communicating with the individual. I believe that everything takes place around them, and that they're not spoken about, in the same way that they might have been under prior models. They've more agency perhaps in the process, and more awareness of the options that are...
The open dialogue approach comes from Finland, of all places. And there's been a long tradition in Scandinavian countries in general, Norway, Sweden, Finland, lesser extent in Denmark, but certainly in Norway and Sweden, particularly in the north of those countries for some reason, of psychotherapeutic approaches to psychosis being something that they've really done over the last 30 years, whereas the rest of the world, as we've already discussed, has gone down a very medicalized approach to treating people with what we would call psychotic problems, hearing voices, delusions, those kind of things, and with diagnoses like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. The tendency has been in most psychiatry to adopt a very medicalized approach to them. So most of the discourse in psychiatry in the last 30 years about the treatment of, I'm not happy with the diagnosis of schizophrenia myself, so I'm kind of putting it in inverted commas.
Yes, okay.
Most of the treatment of schizophrenia has been about drugs. There's been very little really about any kind of psychotherapeutic approach, whereas, as I say, in Scandinavia, they've had this tradition. And one of the ways that's become kind of formulated is in terms of what the Finns, again, it's not all of Finland, it's a place right up in Lapland, right up near the Arctic Circle, where they've developed this open dialogue approach. And that involves really the professionals play a very, very different role than would be traditional within mental health services elsewhere. The idea of the professionals there is not to jump in with the diagnosis and a treatment early on, but they see their job as kind of to help get a family together around the person who's struggling, who's having problems, and to sit with that person, their family, their network. It could be the teacher, it could be an employer, or it could be somebody that's involved with that person. If the person wants, they bring them into the group and they sit, and the job of the professionals is to create the conditions for dialogue. So, and with the person, they come up with a way of understanding the problem, of naming the problem, and coming up with ways of engaging with that problem to try and seek a way forward. And it's slow and it takes time and it goes up and down and that. But where it came to the world's attention really was a journalist by the name of Robert Whitaker, an American journalist. Robert Whitaker is the guy behind the Mad in America site that you've already discussed. Bob Whitaker set this up he wrote a book called Mad in America. He's a very well-regarded science journalist, and he was interested in mental health. And he wrote Mad in America, I'd say about 15, 20 years ago nearly now. And basically he looked at outcome data for people with a diagnosis of schizophrenia going back 100 years in America, basically to see had things got better for people. Were people doing better now than they were 100 years ago? Most things in medicine, we've moved on, we get people better, better than we were doing 100 years ago. And Bob Whitaker looked at all the figures that he could get and all the data, people claiming benefits, being unemployed, all of those kind of, how you would judge whether someone is doing well or not. And lo and behold, he came to the conclusion that actually people are doing worse now in America than they were 100 years ago.
Yeah.
And he reckons it's just American psychiatrists are filling people full of medication, so they're not able to function. And he said, look, we need to look for a different way. And he looked around the world. And one of the things that the open dialogue people did from way back, they really monitored what they were doing. They kept figures on what they were doing. They really researched. Yeah, they really researched what they were doing and their outcomes and whatnot. And quite remarkably, when they work with people in this way, their figures would be telling us that actually people were getting back to work, they're going back to college, they're moving on in their lives, they weren't relapsing, they weren't stuck in the same way that perhaps they were becoming stuck in other services, and they were using a hell of a lot less medication. And so Bob Whitaker wrote about this service in Finland in Open Dialogue, and then when his book kind of caught fire and a lot of people read it, people started to focus attention on this, and Open Dialogue now has become, there are training schemes in Open Dialogue in the UK. A number of services are trying to work in that way, in the States, in Japan. Lots of places around the world are trying to adopt this kind of less diagnostic, less upfront with, it's not that they don't use medication, they do. They
sparingly.
They try to do it as sparingly as possible, and they don't believe it's the only thing that is the only thing that they have in their bag to bring to the to help, So that's the Open Dialogue. And we started that. Isolde Twamley, who was one of the psychologists, got in touch with people in Finland and invited them over. We had 2 people came over a good few years ago now and did a training for most of the staff in the service in West Cork. And then we had Mary Olson, who's an American who also does training around Open Dialogue and has written about it. And she came over and did some training with this. I don't think any of the people in West Cork would claim they're doing Open Dialogue exactly the same as the Finns are.
Right, okay.
Something
in Irish adaptation.
Exactly. You have to. Mental health is messy. Things don't fit into neat boxes,
No.
So.
And to be culturally appropriate as well, if you were doing it somewhere else in Africa or Asia or, specific groups, that makes sense. What sounds nice to me from a sort of human rights perspective as well is that prioritizes agency and choice and voice for the person, in terms of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and nothing about me without me. It's exactly that, wouldn't you say, Pat? Yeah.
Exactly. I think, it does promote that idea of self-definition, and it promotes the idea that the service should really listen, that idea of legal capacity, that the person has a right to say what they want to happen to them, and nobody has a right to take that away from them. Now, in Finland, they do use coercive practices. If people are very mad and very violent or in real difficulty, they do admit people against their will. You know what I mean? It isn't,
Yes.
there's not like there's a nirvana
Yeah.
situation where everything is fine because they work in a different way. They, in many ways, they face all the struggles that we do. But I do think there is evidence that they have reduced the amount of coercion in the service there. And they, you know, that's and using open dialogue, using that approach, because certainly I worked in that way with a, you know, some of the people I worked with before I retired in 2016, and it's a lovely way to work. It's a really nice way for me as a psychiatrist. I enjoyed it, you know, working with people. It's not easy. It's more time consuming. You have to get time and space, and meetings and all of that. But you know, as I say, all of this stuff is messy. And the one thing, if you look at any surveys of service users, you know, you ask them what they want. They want more time,
right?
You know, from the people who, you know, what they can't stand is being given 10 or 15-minute appointments with either doctors or nurses or psychologists or whoever. People need time to tell their stories, to open them up, to feel secure, to feel trust. And I'm not blaming doctors and nurses, because often they're under pressure, and services, you know, create the conditions sometimes for poor relationships. Our clinic systems are, I think, archaic. We need to really rethink how we do a lot of the stuff that we do, but that's another day's discussion.
Yes, it is. Very last question then, because this is about policy. Is there one or two things that you would like to see change in how we approach mental health policy in Ireland?
Well, one very concrete thing was I sat on the expert group that looked at the Mental Health Act. Kathleen Lynch was the Minister for Mental Health at the time, and she appointed me to the group. And it was a really good working group. I think all of the people on it, you know, all the stakeholders were represented on that group. And we worked over about 2 years coming up with ideas about how the Mental Health Act, the 2001 Mental Health Act in Ireland, could be revised, basically. We didn't agree on everything, but it was respectful, and I think we came up with some very useful suggestions for a revision of that. And one of the things in the back of our minds, because the 2001 Act came out, obviously predated the CRPD. Now, right. Ireland has signed up for the CRPD, so we have to try and make our laws around disability and around services compliant with that. So that was in the back of our minds, how we would do that. And I don't think any country in the world has come up with a way of doing absolutely compliant with CRPD, but many countries are moving in that way, and we're challenged to move in that way. So we have to, basically. And there are countries that use a lot less coercion, that are a lot more respectful of people's human rights than other countries. So we need to learn from them. You know, Italy, for example, is doing a lot better than most other European countries. Right? Yeah. Certainly places in Italy. I always say, if I become unwell and have a breakdown, the city I want to go to is Trieste.
That's so interesting.
Yeah. You should research Trieste and maybe go there, because it's a WHO collaborating center. The famous psychiatrist back in the 1970s, Franco Basaglia, who was one of a critical psychiatrist. Basaglia and a movement of other people, not just psychiatrists, but service users, psychologists, artists. A lot of creative people got involved with that movement. It was very radical. They introduced a law in Italy called Law 180 in 1978, which banned admissions to big psychiatric hospitals. So basically, it really challenged Italian mental health systems to radically reform. Now, I think the consensus is that reform, like everything in Italy, is kind of patchy. But some places, it has been a real success. And I think Trieste is one place. It's got the lowest compulsory admission rate in Italy and probably in the world. They really look after people in terms of housing, in terms of one of the things they did way back was to set up social cooperatives. Where people could have employment, could get involved in the creative arts. There's a hotel in Trieste that's run by people who've all been in the mental health system. If you go to the opera in Trieste, the cafe, is the staff there are all people who've been, you know, there's a sense in which the whole city got involved in this. And I think one of the key to the reforms was the way in which politicians and non-mental health service players took responsibility in housing, in employment, as I said, creative arts, in education, in the use of social spaces within the city, all came together to say, look, we have to create the conditions in our city where people blossom and flourish. And if you have a mental health problem, you're not locked away and you're not neglected and forgotten about or abused. So there's a whole, you know, it's a really interesting story.
Fascinating, holistic model, yeah.
Yeah, it's worth anyway, in Ireland, come back to, you were asking me about one single thing that might be helpful was the review group. One of the things, and we came up with a whole bunch of recommendations, but to me, perhaps the most important thing was we asked for a substantial boosting of the role of what's called the Authorised Officer. Okay. Under our current Mental Health Act, we have the role of the Authorised Officer. Admissions can take place to a mental health unit if the application is made by a family member, a member of the Gardaí, a member of the public, or an Authorised Officer. And the Authorised Officer is usually someone who works for the health service, social worker, nurse, can be anyone really, who comes when a family don't want to make that move themselves. It's not used that often. It is used, but it's not used that often. One of the recommendations we were making is that role would be significantly boosted and that all admissions would be applied for by an Authorised Officer. And the role of the Authorised Officer would be to come, if there's a crisis situation, that they would be the experts in alternatives to hospitalisation. Okay. So that they would come and sit with the family and sit with the person, sit with the guards, sit with whatever agencies are involved and say, what's going on here? What can we do to stop this person being admitted? Are there things can we get them to stay in a flat for a hotel or a B&B, or can we get them to do something else? And if we, you know what I mean? That there's lots of creative things other than it just being seen that the only answer to this crisis is that person goes into a psychiatric bed. So the Authorised Officer role would have to be, there'd be a significant investment because that cadre of workers would be expanded and their role would be expanded. And that all admissions would go through them. So the family could apply to the Authorised Officer to come, but they wouldn't have to do that because families hate doing that.
Sure.
They complain about it. So it would deal with that issue. The guards often don't want to be the ones who are directly involved. They don't feel they've got the expertise or whatever. And that, in fairness to them, they do the best they can, but they don't want to. So, as I say, that was one of the things we recommended. There were other recommendations as well. Now, I'm hoping that the new government, whenever it comes into being or whatever, if it does pay attention to mental health, as they all say they will do, our review has been sitting on the desks for the last 3 years, 4 years, 5 years even. And it's been promised that there will be a review of the mental health of the 2001 Act. I would really hope that would be a priority. And we could, change the legislation quite significantly. And I think it would make a big difference. And make us a lot more compliant with CRPD, move us in that direction. And anyway, that's...
Yeah, is your review in the public domain, Pat?
Yes, it is. Yes. I think you can access that through the...
HSC or the Department?
HSC or Department of Health, I think. Department of Health. Yes, it was published. Kathleen Lynch was one of our last things before that government crumbled. That she drove it, and I had a lot of respect for her in the work she did. But I can't remember now when that was, but it was quite a few years ago.
I'll check it out, and I'll urge anyone with an interest in mental health to revive it as an issue now, I
think it's important. Yeah.
The strength in numbers. Well, listen, thank you so much for your time, Dr. Pat Bracken. You're a fascinating man. Welcome. And, so much interesting experience. It was a pleasure talking to you about mental health and well-being for How to Talk Policy and Influence People. Take care.
All right. Thank you.
Bye-bye.